Janet
Let go
McCoy
of
didn't
me.
flinch when
Get
the man's
off!
fist split the air. Sal's 2-4. Our diner sat at
shouldn't
the
have
dead
done
end of
that.
Crescent Avenue, like a wound that never healed, neon humming. Grease thick in the air, the checkered floor sticky under tired shoes. It was 17 inches the morning, the kind of hour where the city stopped pretending to be decent. There was a long-haul trucker in booth 2, face buried in a plate of eggs. A young couple near the window, sharing a strawberry milkshake with 2 straws, not talking, just existing. An old man at the counter, turning a coffee cup in slow circles like he was trying to wind back time. Janet was behind the pie display, restocking the dessert shelf, when the door hit the wall. He came in the way trouble always does, loud, certain, and too big for the space he was walking into. A wall of a man in a black vest, tattoos climbing both arms like vines, eating a condemned building. His eyes found a young customer in booth, one immediately. Not the searching look of someone who got lost, the locked-on stare of someone who came to collect. The trucker kept eating. The couple froze. The old man's cup stopped moving. Janet kept stacking pie. The big man grabbed the customer by the collar and lifted him half out of the seat. The kid's feet scrambled against the booth cushion. A glass of water tipped. Nobody moved. The fist pulled back. It never landed. One moment it was chambered and loaded. The next, it was stopped, caught at the wrist, by a hand that had no business being that fast. Janet McCoy stood between the violence and the victim, her teal uniform immaculate, a single slice of peach pie still balanced in her other hand. She hadn't put it down. She hadn't needed to. Her face said nothing. Not fear, not anger, not even surprise. Just the hollow, patient expression of someone performing a task they had done 10,000 times before and found deeply boring. "Let go of him," she said. Quiet, flat, the way a surgeon says scalpel. The big man looked down at her and laughed the laugh of a man who has never once in his life been stopped by someone smaller than him. He yanked his arm back. It didn't move. Janet shifted her hip 2 inches, rotated her grip a fraction of a degree, and pressed her thumb into a nerve cluster just below the base of his hand. The laugh died. His knees buckled. 300 pounds of tattooed muscle folded onto the checkered floor like a letter being sealed, and the only sound he made was a high, strangled note of pure shock. Janet set the peach pie down on the nearest table. She straightened her apron. In booth 4, Rang Q had not moved since the man walked in. He sat in the back corner, in a black suit, sharp enough to cut glass, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him, his associate in a beige shirt frozen beside him. He watched Janet wipe her hands on the white hem of her apron, the way someone wipes chalk off a board. Finished. Clean. Done. His lips parted slightly. He knew that grip, that exact degree of rotation, that specific nerve point. He had felt it once before, in a concrete holding cell in 2018. In the dark, while 10 men were trying to end his life, and one woman in a corrections uniform stood over him like a wall that refused to fall. He had never learned her name. He had only heard what the other inmates called her, whispered, almost reverent, while she held them back with nothing but a baton and a look that could stop a heart. The warden. Rang Q picked up his coffee cup slowly, set it back down, said nothing. But his eyes calm, sharp, and suddenly very, very focused, did not leave Janet McCoy for the rest of the night. She had saved his life once, in a place she was never supposed to be, for reasons she never explained. Now fate had walked her back into his orbit, wearing a teal uniform and carrying a slice of peach pie. Rang Q was many things: a patient man, a dangerous man, a man who paid every debt he owed, no matter how long it took. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed a pen. He pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser on the table, and he began to write. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below, telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. Janet McCoy's alarm went off at 4:47 every morning. Not 4:45, not 5, 447. An odd number she had chosen deliberately. Years ago. Because odd numbers felt harder to ignore. She had learned early that the difference between the life you wanted and the life you ended up with was mostly a matter of whether you could make yourself get up. Her apartment on the 3rd floor of the Crescent Arms was the kind of place that looked smaller every time she came home. A mattress on a metal frame. A kitchen the size of a generous closet. A window that looked out onto the brick wall of the building next door, close enough to touch if she leaned out and stretched. The radiator knocked all night like something trapped inside it. She had stopped hearing it months ago. She made coffee in a dented percolator, drank it standing at the counter, and was out the door before the sun had finished, deciding whether to bother rising. The walk to Sal's took 11 minutes. She had counted. She took the same route every day, not because it was the fastest, but because familiarity had its own kind of safety. She knew which sidewalk squares were cracked, which dogs barked behind which fences, which storefronts would have their lights on. Predictability was something she had once taken for granted. Now she cultivated it the way other people cultivated gardens. Carefully, deliberately, as if one wrong step might undo everything. She had been at Sal's for 14 months. Before that, a diner in Memphis. Before that, a truck stop outside of Nashville. She moved every year or so, not running exactly, more like orbiting, circling a life she could almost touch, but never quite land in. She was good at starting over. She was good at being invisible. At Sal's, invisible was easy. The regulars didn't want conversation. They wanted coffee, and the illusion that someone was paying attention to them. Janet gave them both, without giving them anything real. She learned their orders before they sat down, remembered their names without ever using them, and kept her eyes low and her smile small. She was efficient, quiet, and entirely forgettable, which was exactly what she needed to be. The only other waitress on rotation was a young woman named Delia, cheerful, unbothered, and mercifully uninterested in asking Janet questions about herself. She hid other things, too. The way she cataloged every entrance and exit the moment she walked into a room. The way she automatically noted where the heaviest objects were, what could be used as a shield, what could be swung. The way her body never fully relaxed even when she was standing still. Some deep muscle in her kept a low, constant tension. Like a spring that had been wound so many times it had forgotten how to uncoil. She had learned to mask it. Soft shoulders, loose jaw, eyes that wandered instead of scanned. The performance of a woman who had never once in her life needed to defend herself. Most nights, the performance held. The night the big man walked into Sal's, something beneath the performance stirred. She had felt it before he reached the booth, a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the way the air changes before lightning. She kept stacking pie. She watched from her peripheral vision the way she had been trained to watch. Not directly, never directly, but with the full, quiet attention of someone who was already 3 steps ahead. She saw his hand close around the customer's collar. She saw the fist pull back. And then something old and reliable woke up in her chest, calm and cold and absolutely certain. And her body moved before her mind gave it permission. She didn't think about the technique. Her hands already knew it. Radius bone rotation, ulnar nerve compression, weight transferred to the left hip to create a lever. The body remembered what the mind was trying to forget. The man went down. The diner went silent. And for exactly 3 seconds, Janet McCoy was not a waitress. Then the 3 seconds ended, and she wiped her hands on her apron and told herself it meant nothing. She almost believed it. The police came at 2:51 and left at 3:40. 2 officers, bored and efficient, took statements from the couple by the window and the trucker, who had barely looked up from his eggs. The big man, whose name turned out to be Denny Voss, with 2 priors for assault and 1 for possession, was walked out in cuffs, still flexing his wrist like he was trying to understand what had happened to it. Janet gave her statement in 8 sentences. She used the word instinct twice. She She made herself sound lucky rather than skilled, which was a particular kind of art she had been practicing for years. When the officers left, the diner thinned out. The couple paid and went. The trucker finished his eggs, left a $3 tip, and disappeared into the pre-dawn dark. The old man at the counter, who had watched the whole thing with the expression of someone watching a film he had already seen, dropped $2 beside his cup and shuffled out without a word. Janet began wiping down the counter. She noticed, without looking directly, that booth 4 was still occupied. The man in the black suit had not moved. His coffee had gone cold. His associate in the beige shirt had leaned close and whispered something 15 minutes ago, and the man in the suit had responded with a single small shake of his head. Since then, the associate had sat very still and said nothing, which suggested he was well practiced in doing exactly that. Janet worked her way down the counter. She refilled the napkin dispensers. She rolled silverware. She was, by every visible measure, a woman who had already moved on from the evening's events entirely. At 4:05, she ran the man's check. She carried it to booth 4 and set it on the table's edge without looking at him. "Take your time," she said, which was what she said to everyone, and meant nothing. She turned to go. "The peach pie," the man said. His English was precise, each word placed with intention, like furniture arranged with care. "Was it good?" Janet stopped. "Most people think so. You set it down before you intervened. You didn't put it on the table. You balanced it on the booth divider, so your hands would be free." A pause. That was not instinct. That was training. She turned back. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not a threat, not a question exactly. More like recognition, the way someone looks at a painting they once owned. "The pie was fine," she said. "Have a good night." She went to the back. She stood in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the storage room and breathed slowly through her nose and told herself that a man in a nice suit, noticing something, did not mean anything at all. Perceptive people existed. It was fine. It meant nothing. When she came back out, booth 4 was empty. On the table, beside the check which he had paid in cash, exact change sat a folded napkin, and on top of the napkin, a neat stack of bills. $500. Janet stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then she unfolded the napkin, written in clean, unhurried script, 4 words and a year. "I remember the holding cell. 2018. The floor did not move. The neon did not flicker. The diner remained exactly as it was. But Janet's hand tightened on the napkin until the paper creased, and the thing she had spent 6 years constructing, the quiet, the routine, the careful smallness of her life, made a sound inside her, like a hairline fracture running through glass. She stood at the empty booth for a long time. Then she folded the napkin, put it in the pocket of her apron, and finished her shift. He came back the next night at 11. Janet knew it was him before the door finished opening, the quality of the silence that preceded him, the way his associate held the door at a particular angle. She was at the far end of the counter and did not turn around, but she moved the coffee pot to her right hand and set down the creamer with her left, and her weight shifted subtly onto the balls of her feet. Old habits. He sat in booth 4 again. His associate started to slide in beside him. The man in the suit said something quiet, and the associate went to sit at the counter instead. Then the man in the suit looked at Janet across the diner, and when she finally met his eyes, he spoke to the room at large. "I'd like to speak privately, if you don't mind." He was not talking to her. He was talking to the 4 other people in the diner. 2 night shift nurses, sharing a basket of fries, a college kid asleep over a textbook, and a cab driver on his break. But his voice had a quality that made the words feel inevitable rather than intrusive, and within 3 minutes, through some alchemy of tone and presence, all 4 of them had gathered their things and left. The associate at the counter followed without being asked. Janet stood behind the counter, alone, in an empty diner, at 11 o'clock at night, looking at a man she had never formally met, whose name she did not know, who had written 4 words on a napkin that had kept her awake for 31 hours. "I owe you a great deal," he said. "My name is Rang Q. I want to be honest with you. I have owed you this conversation for 6 years, and I am sorry it took violence to bring us to the same room." She brought him coffee. She poured her own. She sat down across from him, not because she was comfortable, but because standing felt like waiting to run, and she was done performing. "Talk," she said. He did. He told it plainly, without theater, which she respected more than she wanted to. November 2018. A processing center on the east side, a holding facility that mixed pretrial detainees and overflow from the county jail when the numbers got bad, which, in those years, they always did. There had been a riot. It started in the East Block and moved fast, the way fires move in dry places, and by the time it reached the holding corridor, it had become something beyond noise, beyond disorder. It had become intent. Rang Q had been there as a low-level soldier, pre-trial, not yet the man he had become. He had been on the floor with a broken arm and 2 cracked ribs when 10 men from a rival faction found him. The corridor lights had been cut. The guards were gone, pulled back. He learned later, on the orders of a warden who had his own reasons for wanting certain bodies to go uncounted in the morning. And then a door at the end of the corridor had opened. A corrections officer in a rumpled uniform, badge askew, had walked in alone. She was not supposed to be in that block. She had, he later understood, been put in that block, thrown into the population as punishment, by the same warden, for reasons that were never officially recorded. She had a baton and nothing else. There were 10 men between her and Rang Q, and she walked through them like she was walking through weather. "You said 2 words, Rang Q said. He looked at her steadily. "You said, 'Step back.' And the way you said it," he paused, searching. "I have been in many rooms with dangerous people. I have heard threats from men who could back them up. What you said was not a threat. It was a fact, and every man in that corridor understood it was a fact." Janet wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. 7 kept coming, he continued. 3 stepped back. You held the other 7 off long enough for 2 guards who still had a conscience to reach us. I had a collapsed lung by the time it was over. He turned his cup once on the table. "You never gave your name. The next morning you were gone. I spent 2 years trying to find out who you were. I found out enough." The diner hummed around them. The fry cook moved quietly in the back, respecting whatever was happening in the dining room without needing to understand it. "I know what they did to you afterward," Rang Q said. "The warden's report, the board's findings. The way they made it your fault." His jaw tightened, the only place where his composure showed any seam. "I know you lost everything, and I know you have been here, in this diner, for 14 months, serving pie." Janet said nothing for a long moment. "The pie's good," she said finally. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but its outline. "I have no doubt." He leaned forward slightly. "I want to offer you something. Not charity, not pity. I have no use for either." His voice was direct without being cold. "I need a head of security. Someone I trust. Someone whose judgment under pressure I have witnessed firsthand. I am offering you a salary that would make this place unnecessary. I am offering you a life that matches who you actually are." Janet looked at him. He meant it. That was the thing. He was not performing. There was no angle visible in his face, no flicker of manipulation. He was a man who had decided to pay a debt and had chosen the most direct route. Which made it harder, not easier. She stood. She picked up both coffee cups and carried them to the counter. She set them in the sink and ran the tap and kept her back to him while she found the words, which took longer than she would have liked. "What I did that night," she said, without turning, "I'm not proud of. I put 7 men in the hospital. 2 of them." She stopped, started again. "I was good at my job. Too good. I liked it too much. And I didn't know I liked it too much until I was standing in that corridor, and some part of me was not scared. Some part of me was satisfied. She turned the tap off. That part of me is why I lost everything. That part of me is why I pour coffee now. She turned around. His expression had not changed, but he was listening with his whole body in the way that powerful people rarely bother to do. I don't want to be that person again, she said. I don't want your job. I don't want your world. I want to finish my shift and go home to a bad radiator and do it again tomorrow. Rang Q was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a phone on the counter. A basic one. Nothing identifiable about it. I understand, he said, and stood. He straightened his jacket and looked at her, the way you look at something you are not ready to stop looking at. The phone has one contact. If you ever need anything, you call that number. He picked up his coat from the booth. I will not come back unless you ask me to. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said. What you described the soldier in you, that was not afraid. I have known many frightening people in my life. What you are describing is not a monster. It is a woman who was built for something harder than what the world offered her. He looked at the checkered floor, then back at her. Pouring coffee is a waste. He left. Janet stood at the counter for a long time. Then she picked up the burner phone, carried it to the back, and put it in her locker under her street shoes. She told herself she wouldn't need it. 4 days later, a detective named Okafor knocked on the diner's glass door at 7 a.m. before the open sign was turned. Janet unlocked it and let him in. He was a solid man in his 40s, with a careful face and a notepad he kept closed. He sat at the counter and accepted coffee, and told her, in the measured tone of someone breaking news, they had already decided how to phrase, that Denny Voss had been found in an alley 2 blocks from the processing plant on River Street. Dead. Blunt force trauma, the preliminary report said, though Okafor's expression suggested he found that description insufficient. You had contact with him 4 nights ago, Okafor said. He attacked a customer. I stopped him. The officers took a report. Right. Okafor turned his notepad over on the counter. Miss McCoy, the manner in which Mr. Voss was killed. It has characteristics we associate with organized crime. Specifically, a group we've been monitoring called the Viper Syndicate. He watched her face, which gave him nothing. Does that name mean anything to you? No. The man in booth 4 that night, the one in the black suit who stayed after the police left. He slid a photograph across the counter. Do you know him? The photograph was taken from a distance, grainy, but clear enough. Rang Q, exiting a building she didn't recognize, his associate a step behind. Janet looked at it for exactly as long as a person who didn't recognize him would look at it. He was a customer, she said. He sat in that booth. He had coffee and paid his check. I don't know his name. Okafor looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who was good at his job and knew when a door was being closed in front of him, and had learned to be patient about it. Miss McCoy. He picked the photograph back up. Denny Voss was not a random drunk. We believe he was connected to the Viper Syndicate. We believe his presence in this diner that night was not accidental. He paused. If someone has approached you, or if you feel you're being watched, or if anyone has offered you anything, money, protection, anything, I need you to tell me. Because right now you are sitting at the intersection of 2 very dangerous organizations, and the people in that position tend not to stay healthy for long. Janet poured him more coffee he hadn't asked for. I'm a waitress, she said. I pour coffee and carry pie. Okafor closed his notepad. He stood and put on his coat and left a card on the counter. He was almost to the door when he stopped. You put a 300-pound man on the floor without spilling a milkshake, he said without turning. I read the officer's report. I've been doing this job for 19 years, Miss McCoy, and I know the difference between instinct and training. He pushed the door open. "Be careful." He left. The diner was quiet. The fry cook clanged something in the back. Morning light came through the windows at a low angle, painting the checkered floor in long amber rectangles. Janet stood at the counter and looked at the detective's card. Then she went to her locker. She moved her street shoes aside. She picked up the burner phone and turned it over in her hands. The screen was dark. One contact. No name. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back out to the floor. She straightened the napkin dispensers. She refilled the sugar caddies. She did the work of a woman who had chosen simplicity and intended to keep it. But for the first time in 14 months, her eyes did not stay low. They moved across the diner, across the windows, across the street, visible through the glass quietly, systematically, cataloging every entrance, every exit, every shape that didn't belong. Old habits. They were coming back, whether she invited them or not. She noticed the first one on a Wednesday. He was parked across from the diner in a gray sedan, engine off, and he had been there since her shift started at 6. She clocked him through the window while she was wiping down the pie display, not staring, just present, the way furniture is present. By 9, he had been replaced by a second man in a navy jacket who walked the block slowly and then stopped at the bus stop, that Janet happened to know had been out of service for 3 months. She noticed the third one on Thursday, a woman this time, reading a newspaper outside the laundromat 2 doors down. The newspaper was 2 weeks old. Janet could see the date on the corner from the diner steps. She gave it one more day, because she was a careful person, and careful people confirmed before they acted. By Friday, she had counted 5 of them, rotating in shifts, smooth and unobtrusive, in the way that only trained people managed to be unobtrusive. They were good. They were also not good enough. On Friday night, she waited until her shift ended at midnight. She told the fry cook, Marcus, she was taking the trash out. She went through the kitchen, picked up a black bag from beside the back door, pushed through into the alley, and set the bag down beside the dumpster. Q was already there. He was leaning against the alley wall, with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked entirely unsurprised to see her, which told her he'd been expecting this conversation and had decided to get ahead of it. "You have people watching me," she said. Yes, she had prepared for a denial, or at least a delay, and the directness momentarily disarmed her. She let the silence sit for a moment before she filled it. "I told you I didn't want your world." "You did. Then explain to me why there is a woman with a 2-week-old newspaper who has been sitting outside my laundromat for 3 days. Q was quiet for a moment. He looked at the far end of the alley, then back at her. In the low orange light from the kitchen exhaust lamp, his expression was stripped of its usual careful composure. What was underneath was not weakness. It was something more complicated. The look of a man who had made a decision he stood behind, but understood the cost of. "The Viper Syndicate knows your name," he said. "They have known it since the night you stopped Denny Voss. Within 48 hours of that night, they had your address, your shift schedule, and your prior employment record." He paused. "They killed Voss themselves, because he failed. And they did it 2 blocks from here because they wanted you to hear about it. They are communicating." "Communicating what?" "That you matter to me, and that anything which matters to me is a viable target." He turned to face her fully. "I tried to withdraw my attention from this establishment after our conversation. I stayed away, as I said I would. It made no difference. The association had already been made." His jaw tightened. "The people following you are mine. They are not there to involve you. They are there because the alternative is leaving you unprotected, and that I am not willing to do." The alley was quiet, except for a distant siren and the hum of the kitchen exhaust. Janet stood very still. "You came into my diner," she said, and her voice was low and controlled and precise. "You sat in my booth. You wrote on my napkin. You came back and cleared my restaurant and told me things I have spent 6 years trying to bury. And now you're telling me that because of you, a criminal organization knows where I sleep? Yes, and I don't get a say in any of this. You had a say, he said. You said no. I respected that. What I cannot do is go back and make them unknow what they know. He looked at her steadily. I am sorry, Janet. I am genuinely sorry. I did not intend this. She believed him. That was the infuriating part. She picked up the trash bag and threw it in the dumpster. She stood with her back to him for a moment, both hands on the dumpster's edge, looking at the brick wall beyond it. How many? She asked. At least 12 active in this district. The Vipers are not subtle when they have decided on something. And your people? 5 on rotation. I can increase to 8. She turned around. Fine, but they stay outside. They don't come in. They don't talk to me. They don't make themselves visible to my customers or my staff. And the moment I tell you to pull them, you pull them. Agreed. And you stay away from this diner. He nodded once. She went back inside. She stood at the sink in the kitchen and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at her own reflection in the dark window above the faucet. The woman looking back at her was tired, in a way that sleep didn't touch. She thought about Denny Voss in an alley 2 blocks away. She thought about the detective's card still tucked under the register. She thought about the burner phone in her apron pocket, which had been in her apron pocket every shift since the morning Okafor had walked out the door. She thought about November 2018, which she tried, as a general practice, never to think about. It came anyway. It always did, eventually. She had been a good officer. That was the part that still caught in her chest when she let herself think about it. Not the ending, but the beginning. 8 years at Hargrove County Correctional. And she had been genuinely, specifically good at the work. Not because she liked authority, because she understood people. She understood what happened to people when systems failed them, and she believed, with the stubborn conviction of someone who had grown up on the wrong side of too many systems herself, that her job was to be the part of the system that didn't. Warden Gerald Purcell had understood this about her from the beginning, and had filed it away as a liability. Purcell ran Hargrove the way certain men run things, when no one is watching closely enough, with patience and thoroughness. And the absolute conviction that the rules existed to protect him specifically. He had arrangements with 2 of the gangs inside. He had arrangements with a county commissioner and a procurement officer and a private medical contractor whose billing practices did not bear examination. Janet had started examining them in the spring of 2018, quietly, the way she did everything. She had taken notes. She had made copies. In October 2018, Purcell found out. He did not fire her. Firing her would have created paperwork, questions, a record. Instead, on the night of November 14th, when a coordinated riot broke out across 3 blocks of the facility, a riot that Janet later understood had been deliberately provoked by Purcell's contacts. Inside, Purcell had her badge pulled. And had her physically moved by 2 of his loyal officers into Corridor H of the East Processing Block. A mixed holding corridor. Pre-trial detainees, overflow population, the riot already bleeding through the walls. They locked the door behind her. She still had her baton. She did not have her radio, her keys, or any backup. The lights in Corridor H went out, 11 minutes after they locked the door. What happened in those 11 minutes? And in the 43 minutes after the lights went out, Janet had never told anyone in full. She had given a version of it to the review board, a clipped, procedural account, stripped of everything that mattered, and the review board had used it against her regardless. In Purcell's version, which was the version that survived, she had abandoned her post and instigated a confrontation with inmates that had resulted in 7 hospitalizations. In Purcell's version, she was unstable, reckless, and a danger to the institution. The truth was, she had walked into that corridor and found a man on the floor with a broken arm and 2 cracked ribs, and 10 men standing over him who had been paid. she later learned, to make sure he did not walk out. She had placed herself between them and him because she was an officer of a facility that was supposed to operate under the principle that people awaiting trial were not sentenced to death, and she was, at the bottom of everything, a person who could not watch a system execute someone without trial and do nothing about it. She had not been gentle. She had not had the luxury of gentle. In the dark, with nothing but a baton and the specific advantage of being the only person in the corridor who was not afraid, she had been fast, and she had been deliberate, and she had been brutally, devastatingly effective. When the 2 remaining honest guards finally reached Corridor H, 7 men were on the ground, and the man with the broken arm was still alive. Janet was standing in the center of the corridor with her baton at her side, and she was not shaking. And that was the part she could not forgive herself for. She had just done things that would make most people shake, and she was standing there in the dark, completely still, and the only thing she felt was the cold, functional clarity of a job that had needed doing and had been done. That stillness was what Purcell put in his report. Officer McCoy displayed a disturbing absence of distress following the violent altercation, suggesting a disposition unsuitable for correctional work. The review board had agreed. She lost her badge, her pension, and her record walked out the door, wearing Purcell's version of events like a coat. The man with the broken arm had been transferred before she could learn his name. She had never expected to see him again. She had never expected to be standing in a diner alley 6 years later, being told that the consequence of saving his life had followed her across state lines and was now parked outside her laundromat. The rain started on a Tuesday. It came in off the river, the way the worst weather always did, without particular announcement. Just a steady escalation, from gray sky to heavy air to the kind of downpour that felt personal. By 8 in the evening, the streets outside Sal's were running like shallow rivers, and the neon signs bled long streaks of color across the wet pavement. The diner had thinned by 9, a young woman doing homework in booth 2. An older couple sharing a slice of coconut cake near the window. Marcus in the back, working the flat top, earbuds in. Delia had called in sick. Janet was alone on the floor when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming. One moment the diner was lit, and the next, it was running entirely on the green emergency strip above the kitchen door and the neon from outside, which cast everything in a washed-out, undersea glow. She heard Marcus say something in the kitchen. She was already moving. "Power's out," she said, to the room at large, in a voice calibrated to be calm without being dismissive. "It's probably the storm. Stay where you are. I'll get candles." She went to the supply closet at the back. She did not get candles. She stood in the dark of the closet and listened. 3 seconds. 5, 10. The emergency strip hummed. Rain hammered the roof. And then, underneath it, something that was not rain or wind, the low, deliberate sound of a vehicle engine idling. Then a second one. Both close. Both stationary. They were not parking. They were positioning. Janet reached into her apron pocket and closed her hand around the burner phone. She dialed the single contact. It rang once. "I see it," Ronque said. He was already there. "Back entrance is not yet covered. I am 30 seconds out." "My customers," she said. "I know." She hung up. She went back to the floor fast, and something in the way she moved must have shifted, because the young woman with the homework looked up and her expression changed. "I need all 3 of you to come with me," Janet said. "Quiet, clear, no room for argument. Right now. Don't get your things." "What's happening?" the older man said. "We're going to the walk-in freezer. It's the most insulated room in the building. If the storm gets bad, it's the safest place." Both true. Both, in this moment, also tactical. She moved them through the kitchen, pulling one of Marcus's earbuds out as she passed him. His expression shifting from confusion to alarm in the half-second it took her to say, "Don't ask. Just follow and got all 3 civilians and the fry cook into the walk-in in under 90 seconds. She pulled the interior release handle to confirm it worked from the inside. "Stay here," she told them. "Do not open this door for anyone, except me. If someone else opens it, go to the back corner and get on the floor." She closed them in. She turned around. Rankyu was standing in the kitchen doorway, rain-soaked, his black jacket dark with water, his tie loosened by exactly 1 inch. He said something brief to his associate, who peeled off toward the north exit, without a word, one less variable for Janet to account for. Beyond the kitchen's small back window, the shadow of shapes moved at the end of the alley. "How many?" she said. 8 confirmed, possibly 10. He looked at her. "I have 2 men outside. They are managing the north side. The front and the kitchen will come to us." Janet looked at her kitchen. She had worked this space for 14 months. She knew its geography, the way she knew her own hands, the narrow corridor between the flat top and the prep counter, the shelf where the cast iron sat, the industrial coffee maker that held 8 liters, the rack of knives above the sink. The layout of every surface and angle and piece of equipment she had moved around daily, without ever once thinking about it, the way she was thinking about it now. "You handle the front," she said. "I own the kitchen." Rankyu looked at her for a beat. Then he nodded the nod of one professional, acknowledging another, and moved toward the dining room. Janet took off her apron. She folded it and set it on the prep counter. Then she picked up a cast iron pan in her left hand, checked the temperature on the coffee maker, and waited. They came through the back first. The door held for 4 seconds against the first attempt, which told her they had tools but were being careful about noise. On the second attempt, the lock gave, and 2 men entered in fast sequence, the way people do when they expect resistance and are trying to get through the fatal funnel quickly. They did not expect the narrow corridor between the flat top and the prep counter to be an actual funnel. They did not expect the woman waiting at the end of it to have already done the geometry. The first man took the cast iron across his forearm, not his head, which would have been easier, but Janet was not trying to kill anyone, only stop them, which required precision. The first man did not appreciate, until his arm folded the wrong way, and he went sideways into the prep counter. The second man was already past him and faster, and he was good, genuinely trained, and he got a hand on her wrist before she could reset. She let him have the wrist. She used the grip as an anchor and drove her elbow into his sternum with her full body weight behind it, and when he bent forward, she stepped aside and guided his momentum face first into the shelf above the sink. He stayed down. A third man appeared in the doorway. He was bigger, and he was looking at the first 2 on the floor and recalibrating, which was the smart response, but it cost him half a second. Janet had the coffee maker's dispensing nozzle in her hand. 8 liters, hot enough to end an argument. She aimed low hands and forearms and didn't waste time explaining it to him. From the dining room, she could hear the controlled percussion of Rankyu working sharp, economical sounds, impact and movement, and then stillness, the rhythm of someone who had trained for years in spaces that required elegance, because elegance was the only thing that worked when you were outnumbered. She heard 2 distinct thuds, and then a brief silence, and then the sound of broken glass, and what she identified, by its particular pitch, as someone's collarbone making a decision it would regret. A 4th man came through the kitchen, and this one had made the adjustment. He came low, came fast, came from the side, and he was good enough that the first exchange went nowhere, and the second left Janet with a shallow cut along her left forearm from a blade she hadn't seen until it was already there. She felt the cut the way she had felt things in Corridor H, clinically, noted, and filed. She put him through the prep counter with a joint lock that Rankyu would have recognized instantly, and he stopped moving. Then the kitchen was quiet. She stood in the wreckage of it, flour knocked from a shelf, 2 pans on the floor, the coffee maker still running. A clean smell of hot metal over everything, and breathed through her nose and checked herself, left forearm. Nothing serious. Her hands were steady. The soldier in her chest was very still and very awake, and not one part of her was satisfied by any of this, which felt, for the first time, like something she could live with. She picked up the cast iron pan and went through the kitchen door into the dining room. Rang Q was in the center of the floor, his jacket finally compromised, a long tear at the shoulder seam. Two men were down near the front entrance. One was sitting against the base of the counter holding his ribs. The fourth was trying to stand near booth 4 and not succeeding. Rang Q turned when she came through the door. He looked at her arm. She shook her head, not serious, and he accepted this without pressing it. They stood back to back in the middle of the checkered floor, both breathing steadily, both looking at the exits, both waiting. No one else came. The rain kept falling. The neon kept bleeding color across the windows. From somewhere outside came the sound of Rang Q's men handling what remained of the north side, and then that too went quiet. It was over. Janet set the cast iron pan down on the nearest table. She looked at the diner, overturned chairs, a broken booth divider, glass from a shattered display case scattered across the floor. The peach pie was on the floor. She had restocked it herself 2 days ago. She went to the walk-in freezer and knocked twice. "It's me. It's over. Stay put until I tell you." She heard the young woman say something that might have been a prayer. Okafor arrived 40 minutes later with 6 uniforms and an expression that suggested he had suspected something like this was coming and had not entirely known how to prevent it. Rang Q's lawyers arrived 12 minutes after that, which impressed even Okafor, though he didn't say so. The narrative that emerged from the filing was tight, documented, and technically accurate. The proprietor and staff of Sal's 24, our diner, had been attacked by armed intruders during a power outage, had defended themselves and the civilian patrons present, and had sustained injuries in the process. The civilians in the freezer gave statements that confirmed this. Marcus, the fry cook, gave a statement that confirmed this. The cut on Janet's forearm confirmed this. What the filing did not contain was any reference to the Viper Syndicate, or Rang Q's name, or the specific chain of events that had brought 10 armed men to a diner on Crescent Avenue in the rain. Okafor interviewed Janet in booth 4 at 2 in the morning. He had his notepad open this time. "Self-defense," he said. "Not quite a question. They came in through the back with weapons," she said. "I defended myself and my customers." He looked at her arm, neatly bandaged now by a paramedic who had asked no questions beyond the medical ones. He looked at the kitchen, which 2 of his uniforms were documenting carefully. He looked at the 4 men currently in the back of 2 separate ambulances. "You had help," he said. "Several customers assisted." Okafor wrote something in his notepad. He looked up. "Miss McCoy, I have been doing this long enough to know when a story is clean, because it's true, and when it's clean, because someone very good made it clean." He closed the notepad. "I also know that 8 men attacked a diner, and the people inside that diner are alive. And the 8 men are not in a position to attack anyone else tonight." He tucked the notepad in his jacket. "I'm going to call this self-defense." It was self-defense. "I know," he said, and something in his tone made it an acknowledgement of more than just the legal category. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked at her with the calm, tired respect of a man who had spent 2 decades in proximity to violence and had learned to recognize the difference between people who sought it and people who absorbed it. "Take care of yourself." He left. Rang Q came back 3 days later. The diner was open. Janet had mopped the floor herself the morning after, replaced the display case glass with a piece of plywood until the proper panel arrived, and rearranged the furniture that could be salvaged. The peach pie she had restocked from scratch because it was the thing she could control. And controlling small things was how she had always gotten through the large ones. He came in at 11, before the lunch crowd. He was alone, for the first time she could remember, No associate, no gray sedan outside, no woman with a newspaper down the block. Just him, in a black suit that was not the one from the other night, walking to booth 4 and sitting down. She poured him coffee without being asked. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him, which had become, without either of them deciding it, the particular grammar of their conversations. He placed an envelope on the table between them. She looked at it. "What is that?" "The deed to this building," he said. The previous owner had tax complications. He was willing to negotiate. "The property is now held in your name, in full, with no liens and no attached obligations." He moved the envelope a fraction closer to her. "You are no longer an employee. You are the proprietor. You answer to no one." Janet looked at the envelope for a long time. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No. That is largely why I am giving it to you." He looked at her with the same steady attention he had given her since the first night. "You have saved my life twice now. Once in the dark with a baton, and once in a kitchen with a frying pan. I am not a man who forgets debts, and I am not a man who underpays them. This is too much. It is exactly enough," he said. "No more, no less." She put both hands flat on the table on either side of the envelope. The plywood patch on the display case caught the morning light at an angle. The fry cook's bell rang in the kitchen. Outside, Crescent Avenue was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, ongoing. She picked up the envelope. Ranque stood. He straightened his jacket, and he looked at her across the table with an expression that was not triumph and was not sentiment. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Then he bowed. Not the slight incline of social courtesy, a full, deliberate bow, low enough to be unambiguous. The bow of one person to another person they consider an equal. In his world, she understood, it was one of the few gestures that could not be performed ironically. She held the envelope and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would match it. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the frame the same way he had the first time, she noticed, as if the gesture was a habit, or a ritual, and then he walked out into the November morning, without looking back. Janet sat alone in booth 4. She set the envelope down and turned her coffee cup in her hands. She looked at the checkered floor, the plywood patch, the pie display with its new arrangement of slices. She looked at the apron hanging on the hook by the kitchen door. Her apron, white and practical, slightly creased from the last 3 days of hard use. She got up and walked to the hook. She took the apron down. She tied it at her waist, the same knot she had tied every morning for 14 months, the knot that said invisible and small and safe. But something in the tying was different this morning. She wasn't putting on a disguise. She wasn't building a wall. She was simply a woman who ran a diner, putting on her apron, because there was work to do, and she was the one who was going to do it. The fry cook's bell rang again. The door opened, bringing in a couple stamping rain off their shoes and looking for a table. Janet turned to face them. "Anywhere you'd like," she said. She picked up the coffee pot and went to work. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment below, telling me where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is reaching. Janet tied that apron as an owner, not a fugitive. But the Viper Syndicate doesn't forget, and the full truth about prison night hasn't been told yet. The next chapter is coming. Turn on notifications so you don't miss it, because what happens next will change everything you thought you knew about Janet McCoy. See you there.